Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is K.T. McFarland. She's a foreign policy expert who served in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. She also served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump upon his inauguration. She is the author of the brand new book, literally out Tuesday, Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. And K.T., thanks so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Well, we're going to talk about the revolution in a lot of detail in just a few minutes, but the issue that you raise in this book that's attracted the most attention ahead of today's release of the book, and understandably so, is your description of how you were treated by the government, both the FBI and the Mueller team, as part of the ongoing Russia investigation. So General Flynn was National Security Advisor for just a number of weeks before he was relieved from that position. So what was your reaction, first of all, to all of those machinations, his interview with the FBI and ultimately the president relieving him?
Well, I think General Flynn was set up. He was set up by the FBI and the Justice Department and probably senior levels of the intelligence community who tried to get to President Trump through General Flynn. And then once they had set him up, and they went after him, the Mueller investigation, among others, I think that the amount of pressure that they must have put on him and his family and his finances was so overwhelming. I mean, I can't imagine it. I know what they did to me and the amount of pressure they put on me, financial pressure particularly, and putting me in the position where they were able to take things that I might have said because they had all of the access to all of my records, my phone logs, my telephone conversations, text messages, emails, and they controlled that, and they didn't give that to me. They were able to sit there with all of my information and then basically quiz me on it. And if I made a mistake, if I got the date wrong, if I said that something happened on a Monday when it was actually a Monday night, they could pounce on that and say, well, we don't believe you. We think that that's a lie. And that's what's called a perjury trap, where they trap you and then can come back at you and say, well, we think that's a lie. You have to prove to us that's not a lie. And if you can't, or if you feel that it's going to bankrupt you in order to do this process, then we're going to charge you with perjury. And then we're going to try to get you to say stuff. And although they didn't say it to me in these words, they were much too smart to do that. They left the impression that if I were willing to plead guilty for a crime I didn't commit, they would let me off, or if I was willing to say that other people did things which I didn't think they did, including the President of the United States, then the agony with me would stop. At the end, I came very close, Greg. I mean, I was asked, I'm now in the 30th hour of these inquisitions, and I finally looked at my lawyer and I said, well, what do they want me to say? There's nothing else I can say to them. What do they want me to say? I'll do anything just to make this be over. And my husband intervened, and he said, you can't do that. You can't lie. You can't plead guilty to a crime you didn't commit. You can't finger other people for things that they didn't do. And even if it takes the rest of your life and all of our life savings and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in legal fees, you won't be able to live with yourself. And so in the end, I've said, look, charge me if you want, but I'm not going to plead guilty to a crime I didn't commit. And at that point, once I think the Mueller people realized that I wasn't going to give them what they thought that either had happened or what they wanted, they went away. But I was so traumatized, Greg, I left the country.
KT, you've been in Washington for a long time. You're not new to government. You're not new to dealing with different parts of the government. So if this investigation rattled you and cost you untold sums of money, just how wide of a swath of destruction's the right word, but how many lives were turned upside down by this investigation?
Oh, I'm sure 20, 30, 40 lives were turned upside down. It's not just them. It's their entire families who have to bear the brunt of all of this while it's going on. And we have given our intelligence community and our law enforcement communities, Justice Department, FBI, very powerful tools. And I think that's a good thing, especially when they're going after terrorists or mass murderers. But when they're using those tools to go after citizens, and they're using them for political purposes to try to trap people and get a political result that they want, then I think we're heading into very dangerous territory. When I left the country, I went to the most remote parts of Scotland, Western Scotland, where there was no cell phone or Wi-Fi or television. And my husband and I took long walks in the rain, and I tried to make sense out of it. What was happening to my country? And I realized that this is so much bigger than just me or Trump or even Washington. I think it's a revolution, and it's a decision that the United States has to make. Who governs the country? Is it an elite, self-perpetuating group of Washington bureaucrats and media and permanent politicians, or the American voters? The American voters voted for Donald Trump, and he's our president. And whether you like him or not, he's a duly elected president. If you don't like him, vote for somebody else the next time. But don't try to undo the results of an election, and don't try to sabotage an administration from within just because you didn't vote for the guy.
KT, you talk in the book about the growth and power of the administrative state. You just mentioned it again. Oftentimes in casual lingo, it's referred to as the deep state. And for people who don't like Trump, they see it as a giant conspiracy theory. It's just some shadowy entity to blame for any challenges that he has. So separate fact from fiction for us, because you've been at the front lines of this. What exactly is the administrative state doing? What does it want? And how do you fight back?
I think it feels that it's in charge. And for example, the first meeting I held for the National Security Council staff, I was the Deputy National Security Advisor, and my job was to run the 400-person staff and to take Trump's campaign promises and turn them into policy. So I assembled everybody in the Situation Room, and I went around the table and said, well, this is our policy towards China. This is the revision. We're doing policy towards China, towards Russia, towards Ukraine, towards Iran. And a couple of people just said, well, that's not our policy. And I said, well, yes, it is. Well, that's not the policy we've been following. That's not what the government national security community feels our policy should be. And I said, well, who cares? It's the President of the United States who says policy, not a bunch of bureaucrats. And that, I think, is in a nutshell the problem that Trump faced, that he wanted to have a right turn, a reversal of American economic and foreign and national security policy. And there were a lot of people who've spent 20, 30, 40 years doing things the way they wanted, and they didn't like the fact that some new guy who they didn't think deserved to be president, and some new people who came into government with him who they thought they were smarter than, they didn't think that he had the right to be president. I mean, let me give you an example. So we now have the coronavirus. And President Trump said a couple of days ago, don't let anybody in America who's been exposed to this. So what happened? A State Department employee, a State Department, presumably consular or foreign affairs officer, decided to overrule the President of the United States and let people on a plane who had been infected and who tested positive, he let them on a plane with people who were not tested positive, and they could come back to the United States. Now, supposedly everything was fine because the people who had tested positive, they were in the back or had been exposed to the virus. They were in the back of a plane, and they all had hazmat suits. But this is some bureaucrat who's deciding to take, lives into his own hands and overrule the President of the United States because he thought he was wrong. To me, that's not how things are supposed to happen.
KT, just talk about how much things have changed, because regardless of what folks thought about Trump's interactions with the Ukrainian president and the Bidens and Burisma, any of that, we had a lot of witnesses during the impeachment hearings frustrated, like you said a moment ago, that the president wasn't charting a course on various policies, Ukraine and otherwise, that they agreed with. You've been in government before. How different is that from the Reagan years or the Nixon years or anything?
Well, government's gotten more powerful in the sense that they really do set the agenda and they control the agenda. And when a new president comes in, Reagan had the same problems. It was just not to this extent and on this scale. And also Reagan was a very different personality. I worked for Reagan. I was part of the Reagan Revolution. I was part of the Trump Revolution. I think it's a lot of the same revolution as who gets to really run the country, the people or the professional bureaucrats. One of the things that I recognized, though, was that, and the difference that has happened in Washington today versus maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, is that the United States, we go through these periods of revolution, of grassroots political revolution. We're supposed to. It's in the Constitution. We have the right to throw out the leaders we don't like and to replace them. And because we're America, because we are a dynamic, ever-changing society, we kind of get disconnected from the government. Because government, by its very nature, they dig in, they're status quo, they want to protect their own principles and policies and privileges, and so they resist any change. They're not nimble enough to keep pace with the American society. So every 40 years or 30, 40 years, the American people say, I've had enough. You're not doing what I'm electing you to do. You're not solving my problems. I'm going to elect new people to take the country in a different direction. And it's very disruptive when it happens. I mean, and it has happened throughout our history. That was what the American Revolution was all about. That was the Jacksonian Revolution in the 1830s. That was the Civil War. That was Teddy Roosevelt's revolution. That was the Great Depression and World War II. That was the Reagan Revolution. And they're always hard to live through, and they're miserable, and people scream at each other. But at the end, the American people always win, and we take the country and reinvent it. And that, to me, is the essence of American exceptionalism. Not just that America is where you get to reinvent who you are, but it's where we reinvent the society and the nation. And that's what makes us different from everybody else.
But you said just a moment ago, KT, that we're now at kind of a crossroads where we're going to decide who's going to be running the show. Is it going to be the people, or is it going to be the bureaucrats? So how much danger are we in of the bureaucrats running the show? And other than voting, and that, I'm not dismissing that, but besides voting, what else can be done to give the people the power?
Oh, I think definitely just voting. Educate yourself on the issues and vote. The biggest problem in America, I always thought, was that 40% of the American voting public, people who were eligible to vote, didn't bother. They checked out. They said, well, politics isn't for me. I don't really get involved with this stuff. And what Trump has done, and to a certain extent Bernie Sanders, although I disagree with everything he stands for, he's gotten those people who've been sitting it out on the sidelines, he's gotten them involved in the political discourse. I think that's what Trump did. The people who go to those Trump rallies, a lot of them have never voted before. And all of a sudden, they're now, I guess, awakened, or whatever word you want to use. They're now in the game. And I think at the end of the day, when more and more American people are in the game, then we come to the right conclusions. We always have in the past. And do I have a magic wand to tell you how this works out? No. But I think we've always had the American people who've succeeded in the past. I think this time we will too. But I think that the 2020 election will be the critical one.
Are you concerned that people will hear your story and not want to serve? In other words, if they're against the tide of what's happening in Washington, that they could be financially ruined, they could have their reputations ruined. What's your advice to people if they find themselves in a similar situation to where you were?
First of all, I think that there will be an accounting. The Attorney General, Bill Barr, and the attorney from Connecticut, John Durham, he's in the middle of an investigation, Durham is, and he has impaneled a grand jury, and it's now a criminal investigation. And the investigation is, let's investigate the investigators. Let's look at the Mueller people. Let's look at the people who were running the FBI and the CIA. My guess is he finds that real crimes were committed, and that I hope he brings them to account. And that it's important to do that, because instead of just brushing it out and say, oh, well, it's all finished now, those people are no longer working in government. No, I think they need to be held accountable so that this doesn't happen again. Because otherwise, the result that you've talked about, people are just going to say, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I mean, I might not like these guys, but I don't want to risk my kids' college education fund that I'm going to have to turn over to a bunch of lawyers to defend me for crimes I didn't commit. I don't know. I guess in the end of the day, as much as I've been through a horrible experience, I'm pretty optimistic about the future of the country.
Let me get your response to what I know you've heard over and over and over again for the past few years, and that's essentially the argument from the other side, that Trump has never criticized Putin. At one point, most people would say jokingly, he asked for the Russians during the campaign in 2016 to find the missing emails from Hillary Clinton. The press conference in Helsinki where he said, well, the intelligence professionals have told me this about 2016, but Putin says this. So, and they say he hasn't pursued enough to secure the next election. So they say the evidence is piling up on the Russia issue. You obviously have a very different look at the story. So what's your rebuttal to these endless arguments from the other side?
Well, I do think the Russians have interfered with our elections. I think that they've interfered with our elections and our political process for the last 50 years. Nothing new here. It's just maybe some of the methods are different. Do I think they're going to try to interfere in 2020? Absolutely. You know, I mean, that's what they do. They look at our political system and they realize that in democracy, the best way you can bring down a democracy is to cast doubt and to cast suspicion and to cast division among the body politic, because for democracy to work, you have to trust each other and you have to have compromise. So the Russians, they're busy stirring that pot to try to make that impossible. So the people who are saying, well, Trump, he's too soft on the Russians, look at what he's done. He's given lethal weapons to the Ukrainians so that they can fight the Russians. He has put down some of the most stringent sanctions, not only on Russian businessmen, but on Russian industries. He's also gone to great levels and great extent to try to convince the Europeans not to build a pipeline of Russian oil that would go from Russia to Europe that would make Europe politically dependent and economically dependent on Russia. So the thing about Trump that I've learned, having worked closely with him, is, he says a lot of stuff. I mean, he'll say one week, he says, I love Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. And then the next week, he's having a trash talk Twitterverse campaign against him saying, my missiles are bigger than your missiles. Don't look at what Trump says. Look at what he does. And his actions against Russia have been much more lethal and severe and serious economically, politically, militarily than certainly President Obama.
KT, we could go so mumuch deeper. Thank you so much for your time today. And I would encourage folks, if you want the full story, pick up a copy of Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. KT, thank you very much for your time today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
KT McFarland, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump, also served in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. Again, the book, Revolution. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.